Our friend boosters, without whom this could not happen. And also people we couldn't do this without are the tech crew up back. I see you. Yes. And thank you to all of you as well for just being awesome, awesome audience members this whole entire week. Thank you so, so much. So I have the distinct privilege of introducing our next two presenters for this hour. Both the presenters today are Chicago-based poets. They are Nate Marshall, a Writers Week fave, and Jamila Woods. Yes, yes. So Nate Marshall earned his MFA from University of Michigan, and he is a founding member of the poetry collective Dark Noise. You might know some of his award-winning poetry from the documentary about Louder Than a Bomb, or from his feature on the HBO series Brave New Voices. Jamila Woods earned her degrees from Brown University, and she is the Associate Artistic Director of Young Chicago Authors, where she organizes the festival Louder Than a Bomb. You might also know her through her music. Her 2016 album Heaven came out to wide acclaim, and she has her next album coming out this May. We're very pumped about that. Today is super special because they are doing a special tribute to the late, great Gwendolyn Brooks, who was a phenomenal and influential poet, the first African-American woman to win a Pulitzer Prize. And she was actually here for the very first Writers' Week. The first or the second? The second ever Writers' Week. So she's very near and dear to our hearts. She graced the halls of Fremd High School with her presence. And so these two amazing performers are going to do a tribute to her in honor of her, and we're very lucky to have them do so. So please put your hands together for Nate Marshall and Jamila Woods.
Thank you. Hey y'all, how y'all feeling today? My name is Jamila.
I'm Nate. Hi guys. Hello. What's up?
And we're really excited to be here. Oh
yeah.
No, my computer's dying. You take.
Computer's dying? All right, cool. So we are here to talk about Gwendolyn Brooks. Does anyone know, just show of hands, who knows who Gwendolyn Brooks is? Okay, all right, a fair bit. Okay, cool. So what do you know about her? She's a poet, yeah. What else? Yes, she's a poet. She's from Chicago. Outstanding. 2 for 2. All right, cool. We real cool, right. All right, 3 for, that's the trifecta. Chicago, poet, we real cool. Yeah, we real cool is kind of the name of her like most famous, most widely anthologized poem. Yes, you all are right. Congratulations. Education.
So a little bit more about Gwendolyn Brooks. She was born on June 7th, 1917 in Topeka, Kansas, and then when she was really, really young, her family moved to Chicago, and she was raised and lived most of her life on the south side of Chicago.
So she grew up like in a neighborhood called Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. And after that, she started writing super young. So she started writing when she was like 5 or 6, keeping journals, which you can still find, and it's very kind of crazy to be able to look at. And she took that stuff to her mom, and her mom, like at a really early age, said, "Yo, you're gonna be like a great writer one day." And it ended up being true. She started publishing when she was 13. Her first poem was a poem called Eventide, her first published poem. That came out in the Chicago Defender, an old newspaper. And from that, she like went and had a very long career. She published for over 50 years, from the time she was 13 until 2000 when she passed. She like continued working all the way up until.
Yeah, and she was the first African American to receive a Pulitzer Prize, which is a huge deal, and a lot of her writing focused around Chicago and around her community in Bronzeville, Black life in Chicago. And in addition to being a poet, she was also a dedicated teacher and mentor, so as long as her writing career was, as long or even longer was her career of being a mentor to young people and being a teacher.
Yeah. So she was born in 1917, which was a minute ago. We can safely say. And so in 2017, there was actually a bunch of stuff that happened all over the country, and especially in the Chicago area, to celebrate her like 100th centennial, like the anniversary of her birth, right? And so one of the things that happened was this play called No Blue Memories that we had a chance, me and Jamila had an opportunity to work on. So I wrote the words of the play with our friend Dr. Evel Ewing, and Jamila, alongside her sister and composer Ayana Woods, made the music for the play. But it's not, calling it a play is like a little reductive, so can you like talk a little more about what the thing was?
Yeah, so all I knew originally is that like these people,
Yeah. So that was this thing we helped make. And out of that came this play that myself and Eve Ewing wrote. And I guess I can sort of talk a little bit about that process. So, you know, Miss Brooks had a long life. She lived for like 80 years or so. And so we wanted to figure out how to tell the story of her life in a way that made some sense and just in a way that like honored different parts of her life and the way that her writing continually sort of changed and evolved and whatever. And so we spent, the way we kind of thought about splitting up the play, at least in terms of our writing, is we kind of thought about it in like 3 acts almost, right? So the first act was like kind of her early life. So her as a kid, when she's like super young, there's a scene in it where she like meets her husband, which was kind of a cool story. So we like wanted to include that. And just like her early career, like her sort of establishing herself, right? And then the second act was kind of, you know, when she's an established poet, but then also when there's like a lot of political unrest in the country and in the city, and she begins to see that, and she is influenced by that and begins to like, or I shouldn't say begins, but like continues working with and being pushed by younger poets and younger writers. And then the last sort of piece, it actually is, it's kind of framed as like an 8th grade graduation, because she came and like visited schools like this one, all over, right? And so we wanted to frame it almost as like her giving a speech. And in that one, we included a lot of letters from, some of which were like real letters and some were sort of inspired by real letters, of her corresponding with people, right? Because one thing about her is like, you know, this is like before like Twitter and Facebook and all that. So people just like actually wrote her like letters by hand, and she responded to all of them. She would like, you know, respond to letters from like second graders and young people, and for people who were incarcerated, and from librarians and elders and folks who were just like interested in poetry. And so that was the way that we kind of thought about doing the work. One of the coolest things that we got a chance to do when we were writing the piece was we went to the University of Illinois and got to read through a lot of her letters and read through a lot of her archive. And so that was cool because there were some letters from like very famous people and very famous writers, and some really
classical music, but also like makes trap beats and raps over them and plays bass. So she kind of took over like the music part, and I wrote the lyrics and the melodies. And so the first thing we did was we just did a lot of research, musical research. We were imagining like similar, like, okay, like, you know, that's what she was watching. What kind of music was she listening to? What kind of music was playing in her house when she was growing up? Thinking about those 3 different sections of the play and the 3 different time periods that they took place in. We made playlists to kind of imagine, you know, what was the world sounding like at that time. So this is like an example of one of the playlists we made, a lot of jazz music that influenced the video that you saw. Also, the first thing that we had to do after we finished that trailer was create like the theme song for the play. So that was actually one of the most fun parts, because I did a lot of research on like theme songs and watched like, you know, what are my favorite TV shows, what are their theme songs like, and how can we create like a theme song for this play. And so I'm gonna sing the theme song, which is the first song that we wrote. And being a poet, for me, it was fun to try and make the theme song as if I were writing a persona poem in the voice of Gwendolyn Brooks. So like thinking of this song as maybe something that's playing in her head or that she's thinking about herself. I like to be a fly on the wall. Under my pen I capture it all. My tiny room of troubles and joys, my forever city feeds me the most beautiful noise. Some say I am rather peculiar. I never wish for anything cooler. Praise be the infinite variety of brothers and sisters walking down my street. There'll be no blue memories. 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 Thank you. And even the title, I don't know if you want to talk about where the title comes from.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, I think so the title comes from a song from like an old jazz standard, and it was when me and Eve were writing, we were thinking about like sometimes, especially with like sort of historical figures or people like from a different generation, as younger folks, it can be hard to like think of them as actual people. But we really kind of challenged ourselves to consider Miss Brooks as a person. And so we were like, okay, well, if she, you know, in the same way that like, you know, now music is very influential and often you have books that are kind of named after songs or named after lyrics of songs and vice versa, and there's a sort of like give and take. We wanted to like replicate that, so we thought about like, well, in her moment, what might be some of those songs or some of those things. And I think No Blue Memories might be
Ella Fitzgerald.
Yeah, it's an Ella Fitzgerald standard, which she references in a poem once. So that's where the title came from.
So I think thinking about Gwendolyn Brooks' legacy and how she's influenced us and our writing, I really love this quote when someone was interviewing Gwendolyn Brooks about, you know, what she writes about, why she writes about her neighborhood, Bronzeville, the people in it. She said, "I wrote about what I saw and heard in the street. There was my material." And that was a really cool quote to me when I read it, because I don't know if any of y'all feel this way, but sometimes I just felt like I didn't have anything interesting to write about. Like, my neighborhoods, my family, like, is this like boring? Would that be boring? Would people care about reading about that? But she kind of really inspired me to take my surroundings and my experiences as worthy of being written about.
I guess, well, first, I think we should pause. Are there any questions? I know we've like sort of thrown a lot at y'all, but are there things that stand out so far? Or just like questions that you have?
Yeah.
Ooh, first exposure.
I definitely remember Real Cool, like, somewhere in there. I feel like that was probably the first thing, because that always seemed familiar to me. But I don't think I really started really messing with her, like appreciating her, until I came through Young Chicago Authors, because the way that there was a bridge made for me between like people who I like rappers or artists that I listened to from Chicago, and like they would teach a song like by Common or even by like Chief Keef next to a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, and say these two things aren't that different. They're both people reporting on their communities and saying things that they observe. And that really made me think about poetry, Gwendolyn Brooks, completely differently. And then I kind of dove deeper into her work, and I love listening to interviews of artists that I like. And once I started learning more about her as a person, that was when I started loving her more and seeing more of myself in her.
Yeah. I think probably as a kid, I can't remember like when. I definitely like read We Real Cool in school at some point. The poem that I really remember as like a shorty was a song in the front yard, or a song for the front yard. That poem. Yeah, I remember, because especially like being so the whole kind of idea of that poem is like that the front yard is where things are like prim and neat, and that's where like your parents can watch you and everything is sort of like safe and controlled. But she's like, I kind of want to be in the backyard where like things get a little wild. The alley's right there, might get a little overgrown. Like there might be people who are like a little rougher but a little more interesting, who are like hanging out back there. And I just remember like as a kid sort of like feeling that, like, yeah, right, like there are these ways that my parents and my grandparents or whatever are like very invested in me being in these sort of controlled, safe environments. But I kind of want, I'm like curious, like I want to know more than just that. So that was probably the first thing. And then for me, like when I really like, when it kicked into high gear was probably around 13 or 14, going to YCA and reading the poem Beverly Hills, Chicago. I was like, yeah, absolutely, like fire. Wow. Yeah, drop a bomb on them. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Other questions?
So you said in the play, like you had overhead projectors and stuff like that, like shadow puppets. Like, how did you like move the shadow puppets? I saw like the trailer a little bit.
Yeah. So the trailer. All right, I can explain. The trailer, those puppets are actually a little more complex than the puppets in the show. Those are sort of hyper articulate, and the reason why is because since they're using like, since they're just recording it, they can like take many takes and sort of get things perfect. But the show, the puppets are a little simple, not in what they look like, but just how they move. The way typically that they sort of move is the actors, right? The actors who are like playing the different parts also like learn how to puppet, and they kind of have. You ever seen like, you know how like on an overhead projector you have that little, the like transparency, right? They kind of cut the transparency into strips, and use and connect that to like parts of the puppet, right? Mm-hmm. So like if the puppet is gonna like wave, then right, it's like that.
And they're pulling a strip that's in
right.
between,
There's like a little.
But you can't see projector. You can kind of see it though, which
Yeah.
is the cool part.
Right, and I think the idea of the puppetry is not that it looks exactly perfect, but that it does that it in some ways does kind of look like you can tell that something's happening. You can tell that this is like handmade and hand moved, right?
And they're not hidden; they're like right there on stage. You can see them like doing all the work, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, but the puppetry is very cool. There's like a bunch of different ways that they do effects. Yeah,
What's your favorite? Well, what's both of your guys' favorite scenes from the play?
That's a good question. I like this scene, and it was also one of the funnest songs to write. There's a student that Gwendolyn Brooks had named Haki Madabudi, who's an amazing poet and started a publishing company, and he's still alive today. And so there's this scene where like that character in the play raps, and so we got to write this song that like incorporated the jazzy influences, but also like there was going to be this rapper that me and him would kind of sing back and forth. So that was really fun, and I think the audience always was like, oh my gosh, like, because we would come out to the front and like do this thing together. So that was fun.
That scene is very cool. Mine is so in 1968 there were riots in Chicago when Martin Luther King was murdered, and we kind of depict some of that in the play because Miss Brooks has a very famous kind of long poem about called Riot, and so I really loved the scene with that just because I thought it was kind of cool and well done. There's a lot of drama, both like visually and in the music, and it has probably my favorite effect, which is to affect like fire, right? There's like cutouts of fire, but the way that they do it is they actually put water. They have like a kind of like a little thing of water, and they like just move it over the transparency, and that gives this effect of like, you know how when you look through fire it's like wavy. So that was, I really appreciate the way that scene was made. That's a good question. Oh, maybe, yeah.
What was one of the hardest things about the
The hardest thing, so we could both answer this because we were sort of a part of different pieces of it in some ways. I think for me the hardest thing was figuring out how to, first off, like what manual cinema does is a little, it's unique, and so I like went to a bunch of their shows and had to figure out sort of how they make what they make in order to figure out the best ways to approach writing for that form. So that was challenging, and then also just deciding what pieces, like what poems of Miss Brooks to include and what pieces of her life to include, because she had such a long life, and she has thousands of poems, and we probably use like maybe 5. And so that was like a hard process in some ways to like narrow that down.
I think for me it was just the creating songs from scratch, but like with limitation. So like normally if I'm creating a song, I'll just like sit with the producer and we can make whatever because we're just free. But with this, wanting to make sure it sounded not just like Jamila Woods and Ayanna Woods making a song, but like that it sounded in the world of the play, like I was saying before. And so basing it in research, but still having with ability to be creative within that was a challenge, good challenge.
Right here.
I just wondered if you sought out this medium, so the production company that kind of play, or they find you, and why did you choose it?
So it was a weird process. The way what is essentially happened is they made another project that was unrelated that our friend and kind of collaborator Idomi saw. She works at the Poetry Foundation, and when she saw their work, she was like, "Wow, this is great. We're doing a bunch of stuff in the coming years for Gwendolyn Brooks Centennial. We should have them do something." So she initially commissioned them, and I remember because she came to me and asked me like, "Yo, Nate, who should I have write this thing about Gwendolyn Brooks?" And I didn't say myself, but I wanted to say myself. So I like gave her a list. I was like, "Oh yeah, like what about these people?" and Eve was one of the people on the list. And so she asked Eve, and then Eve was like, Nate, the Poetry Foundation asked me to do this thing, but I don't really feel like I have the capacity to do it on my own. Would you want to work on it with me? And I was like, absolutely. I put your name on that list. I really wanted to put my name on the list, but that felt tacky, so I'm glad that we're here. And so that's kind of how I came into it. And then when we were talking about music, to me it felt really, to me and Eve, it felt important to have like Black musicians who would really understand kind of the world out of which Miss Brooks' work comes, like building the music and performing the music. And so, so Jamila and her sister were like at the very top of our list.
Mm. Yes, and they asked me, and I was like, there's no way I can do this by myself, but you should hire my sister too. So the moral of the story, put your friends on.
Yeah, just nepotism, just absolute, just a lot of nepotism, patronage. That's the story. Yeah. Cool, should we read?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the poems that we kind of use in the play, and probably one of my favorite poems, is a poem called Beverly Hills, Chicago. What is there anything I need to say about this poem? Just that it depicts and it talks about this community, Beverly, and Jamila has a poem that she'll read after that is kind of in conversation with this one because she actually grew up in Beverly.
Yeah, and just for context, Beverly is on the south side of Chicago, which if you understand anything about the south side of Chicago, it's a predominantly Black area, but Beverly is this neighborhood that was historically not Black, historically white and Irish immigrant neighborhood.
Right, cool. Cool. Beverly Hills, Chicago. And the people live till they have white hair. E.M. Price. The dry brown coughing beneath their feet only a while, for the handyman is on his way. These people walk their golden gardens. We say ourselves fortunate to be driving by today, that we may look at them in their gardens where the summer ripeness rots, but not raggedly. Even the leaves fall down in lovelier patterns here. And the refuse is a neat brilliancy. When they flow sweetly into their houses with softness and slowness touched by that everlasting gold, we know what they go to tea. But that does not mean they will throw some little black dots into some water and add sugar and the juice of the cheapest lemons that are sold. While downstairs that woman's vague phonograph bleats, "Knock me a kiss," and the living all to be made again in the sweatingest physical manner. Tomorrow, not that anybody is saying that these people have no trouble, merely that it is trouble with a gold-flecked beautiful banner. Nobody is saying that these people do not ultimately cease to be, and sometimes their passings are even more painful than ours. It is just so often they live until their hair is white. They make excellent corpses among the expensive flowers. Nobody is furious. Nobody hates these people, at least nobody driving by in this car. It is only natural, however, that it should occur to us how much more fortunate they are than we are. It is only natural that we should look and look at their wood and brick and stone and think, while a breath of pine blows, how different these are from our own. We do not want them to have less, but it is only natural that we should think we have not enough. We drive on. We drive on. When we speak to each other, our voices are a little gruff.
So I'm gonna read this poem of mine called Beverly, huh? You must be made of money. Your parents must have grown on trees. Bet your black is tinged with green. Bet you sleep on bags of it. Bet your Barbies climb it. Bet you never wanted. Bet you never had to ask. Bet you golf. Bet you tennis. Bet you got a summer house. Bet you got a credit card. for your 5th birthday. Bet you played with bills for toys. Bet you chew them up for dinner. Bet you spit your black out like tobacco. That's why you talk so. Bet you listen to Green Day. Bet you ain't never heard of Al. Bet your daddy wears a robe around the house. Bet his hands are soft as a frog's belly. Bet your house is on a hill. Bet the grass is always freshly cut. Bet you feel like a princess. Bet the police protect your house. Bet you know their first names. Bet your house has 100 rooms. Bet a black lady comes to clean them.
And then I'll read this poem. This is called Fame, Food, and Liquor, which was the name of like the corner store in my neighborhood. We cut down 115th for a quicker stroll. Past the pastor's house, vacant lot, liquor store, buses pointing out the hood and back. The route every morning goes by the liquor store. The loose Philly blunts hard and dry. The sour mouth washed away by a dull gulp of liquor. Store a honey bun in your fat back pocket. Pray nobody notices your awkward walk. This liquor store sees stumbling often. Out front, the garish stickers fluoresce on the wire windows like winos with liquor store bottles. A small weapon sits behind the counter, hidden by the cigarettes and candy small enough to steal. When the liquor store is locked up, the rolling metals make the window a pastoral, part of our natural habitat. Behold the liquor store, the sugar waters, the Ziploc bag of coins, and Nate's tongue the color of loose pennies in the liquor store. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, for me, like, the reason why I love that poem, Beverly Hills, Chicago, is it was the first time I ever read a poem that was about a place that I actually spent time in, about a place that I actually had been, right? Like, where I went to elementary school was just west of Beverly, and I lived just east of Beverly. So, you know, when she wrote about, like, having this experience of, like, riding through a neighborhood, driving through a neighborhood, and, like, seeing it and, like, thinking about who lives in those houses and what they have and how it's maybe more than what you have and whatever, I'm like, yeah, I've lived that every single day. And just the fact that there was someone writing that years before I was even thought of, right, made me feel a lot of permission and made me feel a lot of power to, like, write what was on my head too, and write about where I was from and write about, like, the people in my life and in my community. And so I love that poem, like, for that.
Yeah, and I feel that, and I really love the complexity of that poem, because it would have been really easy for her to drive through the neighborhood and then write this diss poem to, like, everybody in Beverly, like, y'all suck. But she didn't do that. She instead had this really complicated tension in the poem where she was like, nobody hates these people, nobody's furious. It's just that we're noticing how unfair this is, that someone can have so much just across the train tracks of other people who have so little. So I think I aspire to that level of complexity and kind of empathy in my work, and not to only tell the easiest story or the one that might come to your mind first, but to dig deeper than that.
Yeah, you know, and one thing I do want to mention, right, we sort of spoke to, but beyond Miss Brooks, like, just as a writer, like, she wrote for many years, and, like, her writing is vast and complex and diverse. But beyond that, like, one of the things that I think is most important for her, to me, is that she was always, like, a mentor and an educator and an advocate for all kinds of people, right? For young people and for incarcerated folks and for people who just hung out in libraries because they didn't have anywhere else to go, or for whomever, right? She stayed in conversation with folks, she stayed teaching folks, and she stayed, like, being an incredibly generous advocate, not just for her own work, but for, like, the power of poetry and the power of storytelling and the power of writing more broadly. And so for me, like, every day as a writer, like, that's a thing that I that I think of. Like me and our friend Eve, me and her have a kind of like, not even a running joke because it's actually totally serious, but a lot of times when we might like call each other and ask for advice or think about what to do in like a given sort of professional moment or creative moment, and we just say like, you know, what will Miss Brooks do? What will Gwendolyn Brooks do? And like, yeah, I just like, it's such a gift to have someone who like, who can kind of be that sort of mentor even from beyond, right? Yeah.
Awesome. Does anyone have any last questions in our last minutes? Yeah, right here.
So I heard that you were the singer of Sunday Candy, and I was wondering if you could sing that type of song.
Thank you so much. I can't sing that actually, but I'm really happy that you listened to it. Thank you. Any other questions?
Other questions? Thoughts, comments, concerns? Oh, sorry. Yes.
Who are your favorite artists?
Favorite artists?
Any kind of artist? Like.
Yeah, okay.
All right. I'll give you. All right. There's a painter who I love named Max Sansing. He did my book cover. He is a very dope artist. I also love the rapper Isaiah Rashad. I also love the band The Carolina Chocolate Drops. And I love the comedian Langston Kerman. And the writer Martina Spada.
Drops mic. I love SZA. I love Frida Kahlo. I can't think of all those categories. I love them. Yeah, I love Mick Jenkins' new album. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Good.